Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'll be delivering both the Washington Report and the call to action today. Let's get right to it. The House and Senate will both return today and remain in session through Thursday. The Senate schedule says they'll be here through Friday, but we know better. Last week in the House came back on Tuesday and voted to pass two bills under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed a rule governing floor consideration of four bills. Then the House took up and amended H.R. 2843, the Support for Patients and Communities Reauthorization Act, then passed the bill with the amendment. On Thursday, the House took up and passed H.R. 2931, the Save SBA from Sanctuary Cities Act. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 2967, the Cease Act. On Friday, the House took up and passed H.R. 2906, the American Entrepreneurship First Act, and then they were done. This week in the House will return today with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 12 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, the House will consider 5 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 2096, Protecting Our Nation's Capital Emergency Act, H.R. 884, to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia, and the Repeal the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022. S. 331, the Halt Fentanyl Act. H.R. 2056, the District of Columbia Federal Immigration Compliance Act of 2025, and H.R. 4, the Rescissions Act of 2025, about which we will speak more in just a moment. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to end debate on the nomination of Michael Duffy to serve as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nominations of Allison Hooker to serve as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and Dale Marks to serve as an Assistant Secretary of Defense. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nominations of Michelle Bowman to serve as Vice Chairman for Supervision of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve System, and Edward Walsh to serve as Ambassador of the United States to Ireland. The Senate also voted Wednesday to end debate on the nomination of James O'Neill to serve as Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services. On Thursday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nomination of John Andrew Eisenberg to serve as an Assistant Attorney General. And then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Brett Shumate to be an Assistant Attorney General. And then, after confirming 7 nominations in 1 week's worth of work, they were done. This week in the Senate will come back on Monday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the confirmation of Brett Shumate to be an Assistant Attorney General. Then, based on the Majority Leader's cloture filings, I anticipate we'll see votes on the nominations of David Fotoy to serve as Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Stephen Vaden to serve as Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, and Andrew Hughes to serve as Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Now to the latest on illegal immigration and border security. Be careful what you wish for, they say. That adage is no doubt going through the minds of Democrats who screamed bloody murder at the Trump administration's action in sending back to El Salvador an illegal alien named Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement's agents and then sent back to El Salvador mistakenly, in violation of a court order saying he should be deported to any country other than El Salvador because his lawyers had convinced a judge he had a reasonable fear of persecution by members of a rival gang. You may recall Maryland Democrat Senator Chris Van Hollen traveled to El Salvador to stand in solidarity with and have his picture taken with Abrego Garcia. Well, on Friday, Kilmar Abrego Garcia was returned to the United States, where he was promptly indicted in Tennessee on 2 counts of human trafficking. The government alleges that he was part of a years-long conspiracy to haul illegal aliens from Texas to the interior of the country, and that he personally made more than 100 trips taking illegal aliens from Texas to the interior of the country. Anticipating your questions, if Abrego Garcia is convicted, he will serve his time in an American prison, and then, after he is done serving his time, he will be deported. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, protests against ICE roundups of illegal aliens became violent when protesters outside a Home Depot store in Los Angeles began throwing rocks and cement at Border Patrol vehicles. Federal agents in riot gear responded with tear gas, flashbang grenades, and pepper balls. California Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass refused to allow their law enforcement authorities, those under their control, to assist the ICE agents in enforcing immigration law. President Trump on Saturday ordered the deployment of 2,000 California National Guard troops to the area over the objections of Governor Newsom. President Trump is citing the authority granted him by 10 U.S.C. 12406, referring to a specific provision within Title 10 of the U.S. Code on Armed Services. Explains the New York Times, quote, "Part of that provision allows the federal deployment of National Guard forces if there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States." It also states that the president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. End quote. The directive Trump signed says, quote, "To the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States," end quote. The last time the President of the United States deployed the National Guard without a request from a state's governor was 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson deployed the Alabama National Guard to quell disturbances over civil rights protests. And the last time the National Guard was federalized was in 1992. When President George Herbert Walker Bush responded to a request for help from California Governor Pete Wilson, who needed help putting down riots after police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King. On Sunday afternoon and evening, a riot broke out as at least 2,000 anti-ICE protesters took over the 101, a major freeway that goes through downtown Los Angeles. Quote, "We are overwhelmed," said LAPD Chief Jim McDonnell. Quote, "Tonight we had individuals out there shooting commercial-grade fireworks at our officers. That can kill you," unquote. The LAPD announced on X that, quote, "An unlawful assembly has been declared for the downtown Los Angeles area." Further, said the police department, quote, "Agitators have splintered into and throughout the downtown area. Residents, businesses, and visitors to the downtown area should be alert and report any criminal activity. Officers are responding to several different locations to disperse crowds," end quote. In other words, state and local authorities have lost control of the situation. This is truly remarkable stuff. When given the choice between violence and peace, Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass chose to defend those committing violence. When given the choice between standing with U.S. citizens or standing with people in this country illegally, they chose to stand with people who are in this country illegally. President Trump doesn't just have the right to take action necessary to protect ICE agents doing their job, he has the obligation and the responsibility to do so. This will not end well for anyone who opposes enforcement of the law. Now let's talk about rescissions. As promised last week, the White House delivered to Capitol Hill a rescissions package containing a message asking the Congress to rescind $9.4 billion in already approved spending, $8.3 billion in foreign aid money, and $1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds National Public Radio and the public broadcasting system. Under the provisions of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, enacted in 1974, Congress has 45 days to move a rescissions package through both houses. The measure is not subject to filibuster in the Senate, so it only needs a simple majority in each chamber. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican of Louisiana, took the extraordinary measure of sponsoring the bill himself. The bill is numbered H.R. 4, meaning it is one of the House GOP leadership's most important bills. The first 10 numbers are typically reserved for the majority party, while numbers 11 through 20 are reserved for the minority party. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, for example, is numbered H.R. 1. Scalise announced last Friday that the bill would be scheduled for floor action this week. I expect we'll see it up for consideration on Wednesday or Thursday. The bill is relatively small because it's meant as a test of sorts. The White House wants to see if the Congress is willing to claw back funding it's already approved. And while there is a Republican majority in both houses, neither house has a huge Republican majority, and there are always a few trouble spots on this kind of stuff. In the Senate, for instance, Maine's Susan Collins has said she's got to look into the details of the bill because she supports one of the programs that it cuts. Now let's talk about the Senate's Byrd Rule. Sharpen your pencils and get ready to take notes, because we're about to discuss the Byrd Rule. That's because you're about to start hearing a lot about the Byrd Rule, because the Senate is considering a reconciliation bill, and the Byrd Rule will figure prominently in that consideration. The reconciliation process itself was created by an act of Congress in 1974, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, in fact. A reconciliation bill is debated on the floor of the Senate for no more than 20 hours, and amendments must be germane. That is, it is not subject to unlimited debate. That means it's not subject to filibuster. Use of the reconciliation process allows the Senate to pass a bill with a simple majority vote. In exchange for this streamlining, the subject matter of a reconciliation bill is strictly limited to one of 4 areas. The bill can change and can only change revenues, spending, the deficit, or the national debt. This is very important to understand. The Senate loves its filibuster and does not like to give it up. So the members of the Senate put strict limitations on what kind of legislation can be considered that's not subject to the filibuster. So, back to bypassing the filibuster. This is a major change to the way the Senate usually operates. The Senate prides itself on being a place where debate can go on and on and on. Just a few weeks ago, in fact, we witnessed the spectacle of a senator wanting to make a name for himself, using the rules to take over and hold the Senate floor for more than 25 straight hours, longer than anyone had previously held the floor. The Senate actually didn't even have a means to force an end to debate until 1917, when President Wilson appealed to Senate leaders to find some means to shut down a debate that was blocking consideration of a measure to arm American merchant ships in World War I. The cloture rule, Rule 22 under the rules of the Senate, was finally adopted in that year, 1917, allowing the Senate majority to act when 2/3 of the senators voted to shut down a debate. More than 50 years later, in 1975, the threshold to end debate was lowered from 2/3 to 3/5, that is, from 67 votes to 60. And there it has sat for the last 50 years, forcing the Senate majority to find a way to get at least a few votes from the Senate minority on just about every major piece of legislation you can think of. That was the founders' intent. They wanted things to take a long time in the Senate. They wanted a mechanism to force compromise, to prevent the tyranny of the majority from pushing through popular measures without taking the time to consider long-term consequences. Some of you may be saying, but the founders didn't include the cloture rule. If it's so important, why didn't they include it in the Constitution? Answer: the founders didn't include a means to end debate because they didn't think a majority of the Senate would want to shut down one of their colleagues' desire to continue debating a subject. That's how much they wanted the Senate to be a place to make sure things had enough time to be considered fully. All right, so we've established that the Senate is a place for virtually unlimited debate. Then along comes this new law, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, and it contains a provision that says that under certain conditions, the majority of the Senate, which controls the floor schedule, can bring to the floor a measure that does not have the protection of the filibuster. In other words, using this new procedure, reconciliation strips a member of the minority of one of the most important powers given to any senator. Not surprisingly, senators started slipping things into reconciliation bills that they knew would never get past the filibuster, but had nothing to do with revenues or spending or the deficit or the national debt. They were policy measures, and sharp-eyed members of the opposition would see those provisions and object to their inclusion. And the parliamentarian would examine the provision in question and rule on whether or not it met the test for inclusion in a reconciliation bill. And then the President of the Senate, under the guidance of the parliamentarian, would keep the offensive measure in the bill or strip it out. During consideration of the reconciliation bill in 1985 and 1986, West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, an expert on the rules of the Senate, who regularly used to go to the floor of the Senate to give speeches on the history of the Senate, tracing it back all the way to the Roman Senate, well, he had had enough. So the Senate adopted a set of rules he crafted to prevent abuse of this new law. In 1990, they took those rules and amended the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. They are now found in Section 313 of that act. The Byrd Rule may be called a rule, but make no mistake, it is federal law. The Byrd Rule prevents the inclusion of what it calls extraneous matter in a reconciliation bill, and, helpfully, it defines what it means by extraneous. According to the Congressional Research Service, quote, a provision is considered to be extraneous if it falls under one or more of the following 6 definitions. 1. It does not produce a change in outlays or revenues, or a change in the terms and conditions under which outlays are made or revenues are collected. 2. It produces an outlay increase or revenue decrease when the instructed committee is not in compliance with its instructions. 3. It is outside of the jurisdiction of the committee that submitted the title or provision for inclusion in the reconciliation measure. 4. It produces a change in outlays or revenues which is merely incidental to the non-budgetary components of the provision. 5. It would increase the deficit for a fiscal year beyond the budget window covered by the reconciliation measure. And 6. It recommends changes to Social Security. End quote. So, no changes to Social Security in a reconciliation bill. Every provision in the proposed legislation must be vetted for adherence to the Byrd Rule. Because the Senate loves word games, the vetting process is called the Byrd bath. And when provisions are dropped from the proposed legislation because they fail the Byrd Rule test, they are referred to as Byrd droppings. Let me give you an example. There's a section in H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that includes the text of the REINS Act, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act. This law would require Congress to approve any new rule proposed by a federal agency that has a major impact on the economy, where major is defined as having an impact of $100 million or more annually. Its aim is to increase congressional oversight of agency rulemaking, and move regulatory power back from the administrative state, which is full of non-accountable bureaucrats, to the Congress, where members can be held accountable by their constituents. That's a great piece of legislation, and we need to pass it through both houses and send it to the president. But I'm not at all convinced that the principal purpose of that law is to save money. I could see an argument being made that saving money is a corollary function, an incidental effect, that its principal purpose is to shift regulatory power from the administrative state back to the Congress. And if the Senate's parliamentarian comes to that same conclusion and recommends that the title be removed from the bill before it gets to the Senate floor, it will be dropped. The REINS Act title of the reconciliation bill will become a Byrd dropping. The Senate parliamentarian is a staffer, and she will make recommendations about what should and should not be included that may disappoint members of the House, including conservatives. And some may be tempted to urge their Senate colleagues to overrule or disregard the parliamentarian. To my mind, that would be tantamount to repealing the filibuster. The act of disregarding or overruling the parliamentarian would be done by means of a challenge to the ruling of the chair. It could be done with a simple majority vote. So Republicans have the votes to make it happen if they all choose to vote to overrule or disregard the parliamentarian. That's the so-called nuclear option. But that would set a precedent. We know the Senate is big on precedent, and in particular, the Senate is big on precedent coming back to bite people on the rear end. It was Harry Reid's decision to lower the threshold necessary to confirm Supreme Court nominees that later came back to bite Democrats on the rear end and end up with 3 Trump appointees on the Supreme Court. So don't fall for the siren song, the temptation to demand that Senate Republicans disregard the parliamentarian so they can keep something in the reconciliation bill that shouldn't be there. In the long run, it's not worth it. That's the Byrd Rule. Now to the latest on reconciliation. The reconciliation bill has not yet been completed by the 10 different committees that will contribute titles to the bill. We're still looking at consideration in the Senate the final week of June. And though Speaker Johnson is still saying he believes and hopes the bill will be presented to President Trump before the 4th of July recess, I'm thinking it's more likely that the bill will be presented to him before the August recess. Now to what you've all been waiting for, the meltdown. 10 days ago, the world's richest man and the world's most powerful man stood together in the Oval Office, celebrating the work of Elon Musk as he led the Department of Government Efficiency and found taxpayer savings in the scores of billions of dollars. President Trump lauded Musk and thanked him for his work. It was the kind of send-off reserved for close friends and ideological allies. But just moments later, as soon as the cameras left, events began to unravel when the president confronted Musk about the contents of a file he had been handed right before the meeting began. The file contained information on political donations made by Jared Isaacman, a billionaire entrepreneur known to be an ally of Musk's, who had been nominated to lead NASA. The contributions were made to Democrats, and not that long ago, many in the 2024 cycle, when Trump was leading the Republican ticket. This was not good, the president said, according to the New York Times coverage. Musk responded that a lot of people donate to Democrats and that it would make Trump look good by showing that he was willing to hire people of all stripes. The argument didn't fly, and Isaacman's nomination was axed, even as the Senate Majority Leader had scheduled the nomination for floor consideration. Within days, Musk had posted to X, his social media platform, about his concerns over the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. He was worried that the spending contained in the bill would erase the savings DOJ had found. He posted a chart showing the yearly increase in the national debt and labeled it scary. For the next several days, early in the week, Musk continued to post about his opposition to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the centerpiece of Trump's domestic agenda. He called it a disgusting abomination. He urged Republicans to kill the bill. President Trump remained quiet until Thursday. Until that point, Musk's posts to X had been confined to elaborating on his opposition to the legislation. But on Thursday, Musk got personal, directing his anger at Trump himself. So when Trump was asked during a meeting with the German chancellor about Musk's comments, Trump let loose. He said he was disappointed in Musk, downplayed the importance of Musk's contributions during the campaign, and even said that Musk had developed what he called Trump derangement syndrome after leaving the White House. Musk fired back in real time on X. He claimed the Epstein files hadn't been released because there were references to President Trump in the files. He indicated his support for President Trump's impeachment, and he said that Trump's tariffs would cause a recession by the end of the year. Trump responded on his social media platform, saying maybe he would cancel the government's contracts held by Musk's companies. The feud quieted on Friday, and I haven't seen any further shots being taken by either man. We'll keep our eye on this. Now to The Jenny Beth Show. Episode 123 of The Jenny Beth Show dropped last Wednesday, featuring Jenny Beth's conversation with Tina Descovich, the co-founder and CEO of Moms for Liberty. The two discuss the nationwide movement empowering parents to reclaim control over their children's education. Tina shares how Moms for Liberty grew from a local grassroots effort into a powerful force with over 300 chapters in 48 states. They cover critical issues like parental rights, gender ideology in schools, the truth behind comprehensive sex education, teachers' union influence, and how everyday moms are winning school board elections. It's a great conversation. Highly recommended. And that's our Washington Report for this week. Now, the call to action. Actually, we should call these multiple calls to action. There's a lot going on in Congress now, and we need your help on multiple fronts. You'll be able to find the details on all this stuff on the front page of our website at teapartypatriots.org. That's teapartypatriots.org. There, you'll find a slider that will take you to a page with all kinds of detail, but here's the general outline. We need your help urging the Senate to move forward and move faster on confirming Trump nominees. As we discussed in the Washington Report, last week was a full week for the Senate, and they got a grand total of 7 nominees confirmed. At that rate, Trump's last nominee will be confirmed right before he leaves office in January of 2029. That's just not good enough. We need your help in urging the Senate to strengthen the One Big Beautiful Bill Act the way we discussed last week. You'll find details on the webpage. We need your help in urging both chambers to pass the rescissions package we talked about. That will be on the House floor later this week, so please make sure you call your congressman or congresswoman about that this week, even if you called last week. In fact, please double up on everything you're doing. Even if you called last week, call again this week. The left has these phone call parties going on where they're constantly calling the Capitol switchboard, so we've got to be just as determined. We've got a phone script for you to use, available on the front page of our website at teapartypatriots.org. So be on the lookout later today, maybe tomorrow, for that slider. That's our broadcast for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Please take a moment to share this broadcast with your Facebook friends and post it to your other social media accounts. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Until then, be well and be active.